Throughout evolutionary history, the human species survived by developing a highly specific biological advantage: the capacity for community and deep-rooted empathy. Our brains are hardwired for cooperation. But that exact cooperative instinct, the mechanism that kept early humans alive, functions today as the mind's most critical and exploitable cognitive vulnerability. Look at this anatomical blueprint of the brain. The faint gold glow in the limbic system represents a baseline healthy mind, clinically known as prosocial homeostasis. To ensure survival, this highly efficient system automatically assumes good faith. It defaults to trust. Because this assessment happens instantaneously in the emotional centers of the brain, it completely bypasses the slower, conscious, and logical scrutiny of the prefrontal cortex. Our biological default for survival is built on immediate, unverified trust. That structural design is exactly what makes the brain susceptible to systematic, targeted exploitation. The most efficient exploit of this prosocial baseline comes from a specific psychological threat vector: the dark triad. The triad consists of three distinct, overlapping personality structures: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Clinical research defines these constructs with precise metrics, distinguishing them from the heightened caricatures often found in popular media. These are highly efficient psychological profiles. They are optimized purely for interpersonal resource extraction, operating without the normal biological constraints of empathy. This manipulation sequence functions as a highly structured behavioral algorithm. The protocol follows precise steps: bypassing initial cognitive defenses, hijacking the reward circuitry, and disabling reality testing functions. To defend against this threat, we must stop analyzing manipulation through the lens of interpersonal drama. We have to map it as a mechanical sequence of cognitive breaches. Phase 1 of the exploitation algorithm requires breaching the target's initial boundary defenses. This begins with acute observation. Manipulators deploy a behavioral tactic called mirroring. They intentionally adopt the target's congruent body language, specific vocabulary, and vocal tone. This includes highly subtle physical cues, like synchronizing breathing rates or echoing posture shifts. On the brain blueprint, incoming data targets a specific vulnerability. Artificial mirroring hacks the mirror neuron system, shifting pathways to amber. This triggers a cognitive error. Based on physical mimicry, the brain categorizes the manipulator as safe, lowering structural boundary defenses. This biological shortcut establishes a feeling of intense rapport without requiring the actual time or historical evidence normally needed to build trust. Phase 1 achieves its objective by hacking the brain's internal heuristic for trust. It grants the manipulator immediate, unearned access to the target's inner psychological baseline. Once the boundary breach is established, the protocol immediately advances to Phase 2, love bombing. Clinically, love bombing is the hyper-concentrated, high-velocity application of validation, attention, and perceived affection. The defining characteristic of this tactic is its speed and sheer intensity. The rapid influx of attention isolates the target's focus, pulling them away from outside stabilizing forces. Look closely at the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. The neurobiological goal is to trigger a massive dopaminergic flood. Repeated spikes force the brain to down-regulate its receptors, creating a physiological deficit where the reward center requires the manipulator's presence. This sudden chemical flood extracts a severe cognitive cost: the active suppression of executive functions. The prefrontal cortex essentially shuts down, inhibiting complex risk assessment and logical evaluation. Love bombing functions as a calculated chemical suppression tactic designed to blind the brain's internal security systems. With the analytical defenses offline, the protocol moves to its final and most destructive phase: epistemic distortion, widely known as gaslighting. The core mechanism of gaslighting relies on the systematic and repeated denial of the target's own observable reality. The tactic begins subtly. It starts with micro-denials, injecting phrases like, "that never happened," or "you're remembering it wrong." This works precisely at this stage because the target's reward circuitry is now entirely dependent on the manipulator for its dopamine supply. This dependency creates a severe psychological conflict. The target experiences intense cognitive dissonance between their actual lived memory and the manipulator's newly imposed narrative. To resolve this dissonance, the brain takes drastic action within the hippocampal memory centers, prioritizing chemical attachment over truth. It sacrifices reality testing functions, overriding its retrieval networks to maintain the critical dopamine supply. Gaslighting succeeds because the target's neurobiology has been forcefully coerced into overriding its own sensory data to survive the withdrawal. The end state of the dark triad protocol is a fully compromised, dependent psychological system that is entirely incapable of trusting itself. This shattered structure is the exact opposite of the healthy pro-social homeostasis we observed at the beginning. The root cause of this systemic failure lies in our architecture. The human brain defaults to processing incoming interpersonal data emotionally, rather than analytically. Continuing to navigate social interactions purely on automatic, intuitive trust guarantees total blindness to parasitic psychological profiles. As long as the limbic system remains the primary filter for new relationships, the dark triad algorithm will always find an entry point. The only viable solution against this systemic exploitation is building deliberate, active psychological awareness. This requires a specific defensive mechanism, a forced cognitive override. We can see this illustrated as a structural filter applied directly over the neural network. Executing this override means actively shifting the processing of social cues away from the reactive limbic system and forcing it into the analytical prefrontal cortex. You must deliberately slow down the pacing of new social interactions. This artificial delay gives the slower prefrontal cortex the necessary time to actually analyze the incoming inputs. Behavioral cues like sudden mirroring or intense, rapid validation must be intercepted. They must be treated as observable, sterile data points rather than immediate emotional experiences. By holding these inputs at the boundary, you can test and categorize them objectively before ever allowing your structural defenses to lower. True psychological defense requires recognizing that your own neurobiology is the battlefield. Rational, detached observation is the only effective shield.